What's up guys? Today I wanted to make a video about how to counter both Taras and Marichka. Both of them have been dominating Arena for the past couple months, ever since they were released. And right now there is a 10x7 for both of them. And you're bound to see way more of them than you already saw. Like if you look at the leaderboards from last reset, almost every single team in top 20 had them. And you will see more of them next time. And those champions are incredibly good, and I think Marichka should have a nerf on her passive, and maybe even Taras as well, but definitely Marichka. But there is ways to counter them, and many people don't really even try to fight those teams, and they just dodge them. And I hope that after watching this video, maybe on next reset you can also hit them and you don't have to dodge all of those teams. So there's basically a few different ways that you can counter them, but they all revolve around trying to counter their passive in one way or another, and that's the way to beat them. But first let's look at their kit so we understand why they are so good. So Marichka's entire kit is very good, but passive of course is the main issue here, but the A1 is random ally attack when she does it. And if it's with Taras, if Taras is in the team, Taras will always be the one joining the random ally attack. And this is of course incredibly strong A1 for a support, because she isn't gonna do damage, and debuffs might even hurt her sometimes. So something like this is incredibly good. Her A2 heals all allies and removes decreased max HP, which Taras will have in his kit, so it's like synergizes with him. But apart from healing, it will also give a big shield and strengthen buff. This skill is just overall very good and like perfect fit for arena defense team, but also when her other skills are so strong, maybe Plarium should even consider nerfing this skill. But this skill isn't the main issue, even though it's incredibly good. Then if we look at her A3, it removes debuffs from the team and then gives them turn meter. Now the part where it gives increased resistance, this generally is never used. There might come a time where people find a way to use it, but for now I wouldn't worry about that part of this skill. The strong point of this skill is that it kind of deters people to use bombs against her, and she already has another mechanic that will make them harder to use, but this just overall adds to the making her hard to counter. This wouldn't be incredible standalone, but when all of her other skills are top tier, this becomes very good as well. Now if we look at her A3, this is the main issue why Marichka is so strong and why everybody who has her is using her in their defense team. So when she dies, she will revive the entire team except her with 50% HP and 75% turn meter. The issue with this is that it has no cooldown. Like you might see the 3 turn cooldown here, but it doesn't apply to this part of the skill. It applies to the other part. I'm not sure if this is a bug or this is intended to be this way, but when she has a revive when she dies on no cooldown, and it revives them with 75% turn meter. When you combine that with other revivers, like let's say Sifi, who also revives with full turn meter and is fast, this will cause issues because they can do an endless loop where they are reviving each other, and that's why this skill should have a cooldown, maybe even fairly big one. The second part of this passive skill, which basically makes this 2 passive skills, and I guess Taras basically has 3 passive skills, so this is another insane part about them. But when she gets bomb, poison or HP burn, or anybody in the team, then it will put a block damage on everybody in the team for 1 turn, and this basically makes bombing her very tricky. But there is ways to try bomb her, and I will go to those ideas later in this video. This champion is basically Mountain King on steroids. Mountain King used to be one of the top defense champions a couple years ago, and the reason why he was so good was that he does very high single target damage, and high HP, so he's kind of hard to kill, which was a good combination for a nuker that many nukers couldn't do at this point. And his damage was very good. But Taras does all of that way better, and then several other things. Like, if we go through his kit fast, but most of the kit is not that important. Like, the A1 is just basic damage skill with high multipliers. The A2 is is very high damage skill that stuns enemy, and he also does this skill every time somebody hits Marichka if they're both on the team, which makes this work like Cupidus, except that he's way tankier than Cupidus and he does several other things. And this is only single target skill, but it does very high damage and it's very hard to deal with. And this is the reason why Taras is not only viable in defense, but he's also very good in offense if you have Marichka. You can basically just auto any teams, and people use team comps with like 2 Taras, a Marichka, and then something else as fourth, and they just auto teams. His third skill does incredibly high AoE damage. It has insane multiplier, and it gets increased damage for each buff on the team. And you can stack this with champions like Marichka, who does multiple buffs, or Siphi, or Ursuga, or other champions. Now, if we look at his first passive, or this is basically 2 different passives, but the first passive, the first effect reduces enemy attack by 10% every time he is hit. And this synergizes very well with him because he's very tanky, and then he will get revived, and enemy will probably hit him multiple times, and it will make the fight just last longer. Now, the second part of his first passive is that he puts a fear on all enemies of Orcs, Ogryn, Undead, and Demon Spawn faction at the start of a fight. Now, this adds a lot of RNG to the fights, and many people will avoid him because of this, but there is also a way to use this for your advantage that I will go through later on this video. Now, the second passive that he has is like one of the bigger reasons why he's so strong, and it just flat reduces all damage to him by 50%, which would be insane just in general, but when it's with the HP scaling nuker, who is already very tanky and has another skill that reduces enemy damage, or another passive, this is just insane combo. Now, it does have the drawback that it reduces his max HP, but he also has a way to recover that max HP, and also Marichka does it as well, so this is not really issue. And this is just insane passive and will make the fights last way longer, but there's also ways to counter this, and both of his passive and both of Marichka passives that I will go through in a second. There is several different ways to try counter them, and I'm sure there might be more that I don't know. And if you know anything else that I don't mention, then please say it in comments. But let's go through all of these champions. Like, these are all kind of champion specific ways to counter them. One way to deal with them is that you just kill them multiple times and do enough damage. And Georgit has a good way to do this, because Marichkas will usually be in stone skin, so that you won't be able to kill them. And Georgit might be able to one-shot Marichka through stone skin, and then you can kill her first without her actually being able to proc her passive, and she won't revive anything, and it could be kind of easy fight. Now, the issue with this is that she will often be paired with other revivers, like Siphi, but you might also have lockout in your team, or maybe you're able to kill those as well before they get the turn. But what you would basically do is that you do Georgit A3, kill Marichka, and then you just nuke through the rest of the team. Now, another interesting way to try deal with Marichka, or this is kind of like multiple champions that basically do the same thing, but you could use Lydia passive to try block the revive, and you can build her in, for instance, Bolster to try give additional support to your team, and you just make sure that there isn't another reviver in the enemy team that will be able to get a revive off, after she blocks the revive and puts her passive on the cooldown, But if you're able to do that, then Lydia will be able to deal with Marichka passive. And also, there's a couple other champions that can kind of do the same thing. Basata, that many of you might have, can also kind of do the same thing as Duchess. Now this has more issues, that it only does it for one champion and it has cooldown, and you might get sheeped and so on. So I wouldn't really use this, but it's worth mention. Like, maybe for some reason you have this champion but you don't have Lydia, which isn't likely, but it's also an option that you might consider in your team. And you could build him in shield set as well, like Lydia. Another champion in the same vein as Lydia and Basata is Gamuran, and he's kind of new champion from Shadowkin faction that you might have in your vault and never used. And this is kind of niche way to do it, and I'm not really sure how effective this is, but I do see some people trying to use this tactic. But basically what you can do with him is that after the enemy Marichka is dead, you can use his A3 skill to block revive on her, and then you might be able to finish the fight that way. Now you can do this with other champions as well that have block revive. Like, of course, Rotos will get it if the fight lasts long, but that's probably not the best way to deal with it. But also, for instance, Initve from Demon Swan basically does the same thing. Like, he has a passive that revives, that he has a passive that puts block revive on all of his kills if he kills them. And you could try to use him with another nuker or him with a bunch of supports to kill Marichka, and then she won't be able to use her passive. You could also try to use bombs against Marichka. She is usually built in stone skin, so she is kind of susceptible to bombs. The main issue with this is that her passive puts block damage skill on her if she gets bombed, poisoned or burned. But you could use bombs that last more than one turn. Or alternatively, like, the most common way people use bombs nowadays is with Astralit and Vizier, and Astralit will put bomb on one champion that is unresistible, and then Vizier will spread it to everybody else in the team, which is also unresistible. And it's one turn, which is normally very good, so that enemy won't be able to do anything in between the damage. But against Marichka this won't work. But you could... There is an epic champion that basically does the same thing as Marichka. There is an epic champion that does basically the same thing as Tuhanarak, and that's Harken Greatblade from also Barbarians. The issue with her, and why she isn't used, is that when she applies the debuff spread, she also increases the duration on the bombs or any buffs that, or any debuffs that she spreads. But this could be good against Marichka, because now you could have bombs with longer duration, and her passive would run out. Another way that you could try to deal with bombs is to use Suzerain Katon from Undead Hordes, another champion that you might have in your vault that you have never used. I think I have like 2 or 3 of these as well. And he does have a skill that removes block damage, among other things, from enemy, and it's unresistible. So if you put bombs with Astralit and then you spread them, and then you're able to remove the block damage on enemy, and you're able to go first, this would be one way to deal with them. I have seen some people using this tactic, but it can be kind of hard to pull off, but it's something worth mentioning that you might be able to do. Now, another very simple way to counter his passive, or both Taras, this is also very good against Taras, is using skills that block passive. Now Ronda, that most people should have, has very good A2 that does a lot of damage and ignores shield and defense, and is a 3-hitter. But also what it does is that before hitting, it will block passives on enemy champion. And you can use this on Marichka, and if you kill her with this skill, she won't be able to revive with her passive. And it will also work against Taras, and you will be able to kill him, and his damage reduction isn't enough to save him. I personally use this tactic. This is one of the more easy ways to pull off this Marichka counter. If you saw my last reset video, you saw that I was using this skill, and I was getting pretty fast fights against some teams. And actually, let's watch a fight where I'm using those teams so that you can see those matches. Now, another champion that can basically do the same thing is Ramanto. Now, he does have his drawbacks, and you might run into issues with polymorph, but if you're able to find teams without polymorph, or if you just wanna take a risk, he can also block passives and do several other things, as you might know. Also, another interesting way that I saw somebody countering Marichka Taras comes from a clanmate called Lam Fong, and he's basically been focusing on both Taras and Marichka teams, and he's been hunting them for a few weeks. And he has a very interesting team where he uses Shamael passive to remove the fears from his teammates. And not only does it remove the fears, but it also gives his leader in the team, which for him is Yumeko, turn meter, which allows her to go first and put the enemy skills on cooldown. And because she's able to remove the fears and go first with this tactic, and able to get the enemy reviver's skills on cooldown, he's just able to auto enemy down and finish the fight fairly fast. And he's also using the Shamal as a nuker, as a second nuker with Rotos, and he's able to deal a lot of damage because he ignores defense with his skill. And yeah, this was very interesting tactic. He was kind of being creative here and trying to do his own ways to counter these champions. And this is what I recommend you guys to do as well. Like, play around with your champions, think about the ideas in this video, and maybe you can just copy paste some of them, or maybe you can combine them, or maybe you have some other ideas and you can use parts of the tactics that I mentioned and try to find ways with your own account to beat these teams. Also, if you have any other ways that you already know or you come up with to deal with Taras and Marichka, then please tell me in comments. I'm very curious to find more strategies, and if there's any other good ways, maybe I will use them as well. For now I'm using Ronda to deal with her, but the meta will develop and people will make their Marichka teams better, and I'm sure I have to adapt with my teams at some point. But thanks a lot for watching this video, and I hope you found some information that you can use in your own gameplay in future, and see you next time.